All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're putting a massive, deeply ingrained cultural assumption right under the magnifying glass, an assumption about how we actually learn. See, we generally believe that freedom is a good thing, right? And therefore, more freedom and more options must be incredibly good for us. But what if the very thing we celebrate in American higher education is actually holding students back? What if the endless buffet of academic options is doing way more harm than good? I am so excited to guide you through this fascinating source material because it literally flips the script on how we think about student autonomy and intellectual growth.
So ask yourself this, is having more choices always better for your education? Here in the West, and particularly in the United States, we have this fundamental pedagogical philosophy. We assume that granting students maximum latitude to select their courses, their majors, and their learning pathways inherently creates a much better educational experience. We think it allows students to perfectly tailor their journey to their specific interests, but as we'll see from research in cognitive psychology and behavioral economics, that's just not the case. It turns out this relationship isn't a straight line going up. It is heavily subject to diminishing returns.
There's this massive gap between expectation and reality here. On one hand, we absolutely expect ultimate freedom. That's the idea that you are the master of your own destiny, single-handedly crafting the perfect intellect. But the reality? It's often just decision paralysis. The source material outlines how the simple act of offering an overwhelming array of options actually creates a huge psychological burden. So instead of empowering students, it inadvertently hinders the fundamental goals of higher learning, which of course are deep learning and robust critical thinking.
Section 1. The Infinite Course Catalog. To really grasp what a modern university curriculum is like, imagine having to choose your life's path from a menu with 10,000 items. Think about it. It's Friday night, you sit down to stream a movie, and you spend 45 minutes just relentlessly scrolling through thousands of titles, only to give up and watch something you've already seen 10 times. Or you look at a massive 20-page restaurant menu and just panic order a burger. Now multiply that pressure by 1,000,000 because we are talking about a student's future career, their academic identity, and a massive financial investment. That is exactly what an expansive university course catalog feels like to an undergraduate today.
Section 2. The Psychology of Choice.
And that brings us to the psychological villain of our story, the paradox of choice. This is a brilliant, seminal theory by psychologist Barry Schwartz. It explicitly states that while a moderate amount of choice is liberating and conducive to satisfaction, a massive overabundance of options leads to paralysis, regret, and ultimately diminished happiness and performance. So, when students face hundreds or even thousands of course offerings, the sheer cognitive load required to evaluate, compare, and select from that vast array becomes completely overwhelming. They experience severe decision fatigue.
So how does a beautiful buffet of options turn into an exhausting burden? We can systematically break Schwartz's theory down into 4 cognitive mechanisms. First up, opportunity costs. Every time you make a choice, you're implicitly giving up dozens of others, which leaves you with this lingering sense of what could have been. Second, the escalation of expectations. With so many options, you expect to find the absolutely perfect course. So if the class is just good, you feel disappointed. Third is self-blame and regret. If a decision goes poorly, you blame yourself because, hey, you had so many other options to choose from. And fourth, paralysis by analysis. The complexity is so high that students just procrastinate or they rely on superficial criteria, like what time does the class start, rather than genuine intellectual curiosity.
Now you might be thinking, well, shouldn't a smart student just weigh the pros and cons? In a perfect economic model, sure. Rational choice theory assumes perfect economic actors who are always maximizing utility. But let's be real, students aren't robots. In reality, their choices are heavily influenced by peer pressure, parental expectations, and cognitive biases, mental shortcuts known as heuristics. They might pick a major just because it sounds lucrative, or take a class simply because their friends are. Throw in FOMO, the fear of missing out, and their finite cognitive capacity to process thousands of data points, and you quickly realize that the perfectly rational student is basically a myth.
Section 3. The Deep Learning Deficit.
When you're faced with a massive catalog, especially with those broad general education requirements, it's incredibly tempting to default to surface learning. Students end up flitting from one introductory course to another, adopting this sort of sampling approach. They memorize facts just to pass the test without any genuine comprehension. Because they're jumping around constantly trying to cover breadth, they completely miss out on deep learning. And deep learning is crucial. It requires the active processing, the synthesizing of ideas, and the cumulative building that is absolutely necessary for true mastery.
This actually triggers a very clear cause and effect chain rooted in cognitive load theory. We start right at the top with curriculum abundance. Because human working memory has a strictly limited capacity, all these options immediately trigger cognitive overload. Students are burning immense mental energy just trying to choose what to do. With those cognitive resources depleted, we hit step 3, diluted focus. And that inevitably leads to shallow retention. The brain's capacity for memory consolidation is totally compromised, meaning the student simply doesn't retain the material over the long term.
Let's make this super concrete with a great example from the source material. Say you're a student who is deeply interested in the ethical implications of artificial intelligence. A broad, hyper-specialized curriculum offers you courses in computer science, philosophy, and sociology. Great, right? Well, if these courses are taught in complete isolation, each with its own jargon and distinct departmental perspective, you're going to struggle to synthesize them. The technical knowledge from computer science never truly merges with the ethical reasoning of philosophy. The knowledge stays totally siloed and fragmented.
Section 4. The critical thinking crisis.
The sheer pressure of endless options actually fundamentally changes student behavior. Instead of active, passionate inquiry, we get passive selection, choosing a path strictly based on convenience. We also see a dangerous reliance on external validation, where students obsess over picking the best major for societal prestige, rather than cultivating their own intrinsic motivation. This fuels even more FOMO and social comparison, which ultimately results in decreased intellectual risk-taking. True critical thinking requires challenging established ideas and embracing discomfort. But when faced with thousands of choices, students just look for the safest, most straightforward path.
And this creates a pretty stark divide in the quality of education. The abundance of highly specialized courses promotes mechanistic learning. That's treating knowledge as a collection of discrete, decontextualized facts. You learn exactly how to perform a task, but you never stop to ask why. By navigating predefined, hyper-specialized paths, students completely neglect philosophical inquiry. They lose the ability to question fundamental assumptions, to explore the nature of truth, and to ask the big what-if questions that are just absolutely essential for a truly critical mind.
And we aren't just guessing here. There's real empirical evidence backing this up across multiple domains. First, in STEM fields, we see that students overwhelmed by the vast array of subdisciplines who make superficial choices are significantly more likely to switch majors or drop out entirely. Second, broad general education requirements with too many electives consistently result in superficial engagement and a real lack of deep conceptual understanding. And third, look at analogous studies in consumer behavior, like those famous studies on supermarket jam or retirement plan selections. They prove time and time again that too much choice directly leads to lower satisfaction and severe choice fatigue.
Section 5. The purpose of education.
So, I want to introduce a philosophical concept mentioned in our source material called telos. It essentially means the ultimate object, aim, or purpose of a thing. If the telos of higher education is to cultivate critical thinkers, lifelong learners, and engaged citizens, well, then we have to admit that our current model of curriculum abundance might be entirely counterproductive. By focusing so heavily on the liberty of choice, we might actually be distracting students from the deeper, far more challenging work of real intellectual development.
This completely challenges our very definition of authenticity, prompting an incredibly powerful question from the source text. Is a choice truly autonomous if it is made under the duress of overwhelming options, cognitive overload, and external pressures? True autonomy is supposed to involve making choices that align with your authentic self. But the paradox of choice makes it incredibly difficult for students to discern their genuine interests through the thick fog of external influences and mental exhaustion.
Which brings us to a crucial, lingering question. Can we design educational systems that prioritize profound understanding over mere selection? The source material makes a really compelling case. Sometimes less, when it's thoughtfully curated and purposefully presented, is actually far more. We need better guidance, stronger interdisciplinary connections, and systems that protect students from choice fatigue so they can actually focus on learning. It's a massive, systemic challenge, but it's an absolutely vital one for all of us to reflect on. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this leaves you looking at your own choices, educational or otherwise, in a whole new light.